Hello. So I've been doing a little bit of research on natural disasters. I've always found it useful and interesting to look at timescales as a way of, obviously looking at history, but also as a way of kind of putting things into context. So when we think of whenever a big disaster hits the world, an earthquake or a tsunami or a cyclone, a typhoon, a hurricane, very often it's said, "Oh, things are terrible, things are out of control, it's never been so bad." So I think therefore it's useful to look at time frames of say 10 years. So looking back 10 years ago, 2008, 20 years ago, 1998, and so on. And that can sometimes be useful for comparing and contrasting. Now, the point here is not to make any sort of political statement, but it's just interesting to see things in context that sometimes we think maybe a particular year is bad, but then other years are actually worse. So I just think it's interesting. So for this video, I'm going to be looking at the year 1998, 20 years ago. Now, I think that's an interesting starting point because it was towards the end of the 20th century, towards the beginning of this new millennium. And it's an interesting time because this is just before the era of social media, of Facebook, of YouTube in particular. And I think that's significant because a lot of these disasters I'm going to be talking about, despite the huge death tolls, there's virtually no videos online about them, or very, very few. One example being the Gujarat cyclone. I do believe that with the presence of YouTube and social media today, 20 years on, even smaller disasters would get a lot more coverage, which is probably a good thing in terms of it being a historical archive. So, without further ado, what I'm going to do is just go through some of these big natural disasters of the year 1998, focusing just on 1998. And if I have time, I'll do a video also for 2008, which I also believe was a particularly turbulent year in terms of natural disasters. So, Hurricane Mitch. This was a particularly powerful Atlantic hurricane, and it was particularly devastating in Honduras. The casualties are estimated at 11,000 dead, and of that, around half of the fatalities were in Honduras. I'm 32, and that's a disaster I still actually remember. It's not that I followed the news closely at that time, but somehow I have a conscience. I have, that is to say, I have a kind of distant memory of that being in the background, even though I didn't follow news events at the time. The same year, like I say, the Gujarat cyclone, it didn't get quite as much coverage, but that was a particularly devastating Indian cyclone season, North Indian Ocean cyclone season. And in the Gujarat cyclone alone, about 10,000 people perished. It's somewhat unusual because in the North Indian Ocean cyclonic cycle, most of the devastating cyclones are on the east coast of India. So the state of Odisha and around Bangladesh. So I think this was more unusual in that it was particularly devastating on the west coast. Um, Perhaps connected to this was the Malpa landslide in Uttar Pradesh. 221 people perished. The China floods, particularly around the Yangtze River. Now, there is widely circulating figures over exactly how many people died, but whatever way we look at it, it's particularly devastating. Anywhere from 3,500 to 12,000 fatalities in the China floods that year, particularly around the Yangtze River. China, like India, floods almost every year, and almost every year there's deaths, but it's not every year you have so many deaths going into the thousands. So 1998 was a particularly devastating year. Having said that, that's still small scale compared to two particularly devastating years, which was 1887 and 1931. In fact, the 1931 Yangtze River flood may have been the worst natural disaster in history. Somewhere like 3 million people may have perished. 1938 was also a devastating year. 1887, 1931, and 1938. And of course, the archival footage that's available from those periods are very, very scant, which I find quite sad because, the sheer number of fatalities is staggering. But 1998, up to 12,000 dead. Papua New Guinea experienced a major earthquake tsunami event that year. It is in a seismically active zone, but that year was particularly bad, 2,200 plus. Now, so far, the most devastating earthquake this year has also been in Papua New Guinea. Um, the earthquake itself and the aftershocks, around 189 people have perished. And there's footage online of supermarkets and all the goods flying off the shelves. It's also the most powerful earthquake this year. Most powerful doesn't necessarily mean most deadly, but in this case, that is so far the deadliest earthquake of 2018. But 1998, 2,200 in the earthquake and subsequent tsunami. 1998 also saw devastating earthquakes in Afghanistan. February that year, between 2,300 and 4,000 people perished on the Afghan-Tajikistan border. And May that year, another devastating earthquake, about 4,000 perished. Um, and bear in mind, this was in a country that's already, dirt poor, and at that time it was still going through a civil war. Well, it's been going through a civil war for the past almost 40 years. So really, when a natural disaster hits Afghanistan, it's really, the straw that broke the camel's back. It's like, can one country take so much? For a country to be going through civil war, then face a devastating natural disaster as well. It's really tragic. There was a deadly earthquake in Turkey that year in Adana, Saham. 145 people perished. In the Philippines, Super Typhoon Babs, Loleng, 356 people died. Also that year, in the island of Luzon in the Philippines, 122 perished when Typhoon Zeb hit. All of this in the year 1998. And, I may well be missing something. There may well be other disasters that year that I haven't included. But really, I think that does stand out. That's a particularly deadly year for natural disasters. So far, I don't think 2018 has been quite as bad as either 98 or 2008. This year, we've had the Papua New Guinea earthquake with about 189 fatalities. Serious dust storms in India. That's been quite devastating. Over 100 people have died in that. Um, and in Kenya, devastating floods have left over 80 dead. But compared to 1998, I don't think this year has been quite as bad. So I really do think there's variation between years. Having said that, we are only in May, so anything can happen. Okay. If you're from any of the countries that I've mentioned, if you have any recollections of these disasters, please feel free to share your thoughts. Um, and I'm making this out of, in a respectful way. It's not to be crude or flippant about these devastating tragedies. Okay, let me know your thoughts.